I'm gonna, so we just don't have the weird audio coming in when they start.
Okay.
Is
So,
that I'm ready to go?
so we're gonna introduce ourselves first, and then it's gonna be the bio.
And don't introduce ourselves when they join. We can talk to them a little bit and then introduce ourselves, or let's wait, stall a little bit more.
Oh, I think you're muted, Annika.
Everyone, someone start talking to somebody, Max to your friend Ian, because like we just need some kind of like filler or something, so it's not too awkward and us waiting around. Should I admit all?
Okay. Oh, after I introduce myself, Annika, you can just introduce. Let's say this is a festival and stuff like that. Okay.
I can
I should do that after I say welcome in.
Oh, okay.
Admitting all.
Hi
Hi everybody. Welcome to the first event. I mean, the third event of the inaugural festival. Today we have Leo Damrosch coming. He is a Harvard professor, and I guess I'll just let everybody introduce themselves.
Okay. My name is Max. If you weren't here the last couple of sessions, I go to university school. I'm a junior there. It's in Northeast Ohio. And my favorite book and author is George Saunders right now. I just got his new anthology. I think it came out a couple months ago. I'm excited to read that.
Okay, I'm Anaka. I go to St. Anne's in Brooklyn, and I'm a junior. And I would say my favorite book is probably Panin by Vladimir Nabokov, but it's up for debate.
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm a ninth grader at Spence in New York City, and I have a lot of favorite authors, but if I had to choose one, it would probably be Jacqueline Woodson. And one of my favorite books by her is one of her more recent works, Red at the Bone. And a really cool fun fact is I was actually met Jacqueline Woodson once in a line for a movie.
Hi, I'm Sarah. If you don't know me, it's because I was not here at the festival yesterday. So I'm new here. I'll be helping to host the festival today. I am a sophomore at Great Neck South High School, and I enjoy reading fantasy and mystery. So one of my favorite authors is Leigh Bardugo.
And if you guys are able to, I know it's early, but if you're able to turn on your cameras and get ready to participate in the festival.
Also, if you want, take some notes. I think it'll be interesting. And we'll have a Q&A session for the audience afterwards too.
So yeah, just also that's a good reminder. Try to remember to, because we're having a Q&A after our author interview. It's a good idea to keep that in mind when you're to draft questions during the interview sessions and when we're reading the excerpt.
So I'm going to start by introducing our guest speaker today before he arrives. So our guest speaker is Leo Damrosch. He is a professor at Harvard University. He writes literary criticism, different biographies. He does a lot of research. So he spent his boyhood in the mountains of the Philippines, and he was born in 1941 in Manila. So he was educated at Yale, Trinity College, Cambridge, and Princeton, and he's taught before at the University of Virginia and the University of Maryland. And as I mentioned before, he was a professor at Harvard, and he is now an emeritus professor of literature at Harvard. His most recent books are Jonathan Swift, His Life and His World. We're going to be reading an excerpt from his book later, which will be read by Anna. And he was the winner of numerous prizes, including the National Book Critics Circle Award in Biography, and he was also one of 2 finalists for the Pulitzer Prize in Biography. And he was also a Pulitzer Prize nominee later on. And he has also run numerous other books for his journalism, and he's also the author of other biographies, for example, Jean Jacques of Rousseau, The Restless Genius. And yeah, so let's read the excerpt. And Anna, you can go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So as Sarah said, I'm going to be reading an excerpt from his book, Jonathan Swift, His Life and His. This is from chapter 1, Beginnings.
You can
The
also
story.
sorry. you can access the PDF in chat to follow along. And if you find any sentences that anything that jumps out to you, you find really interesting, please make the note of that in chat. This is a good way to participate throughout the literary festival, is jumping in chat when you hear something particularly interesting, or a sentence that is striking.
Okay, yeah. So this is from chapter 1, beginnings. The story that Jonathan Swift told is that he came into the world on November 30th, 1667, in the house of his uncle Godwin Swift in a little Dublin alley known as Hoey's Court. He was born there because his father had recently died at the age of 27, and his mother, Abigail, had moved in with her Swift relatives. The baby was named Jonathan after his father. Abigail also had an 18-month-old daughter, Jane, and hardly any money. These, at least, were the facts as Swift understood them. But strangely, nothing is certain about his early years, including the date of his birth. The year may not even have been 1667. He was presumably baptized in the nearby parish church, St. Werburgh's, but when he had the church register searched years later, there was no record of the baptism. This may or may not be significant. A colleague of his thought the omission must have been due to the carelessness of the vestry clerk at that time. On the other hand, it's conceivable that he was baptized someplace else and not necessarily in a church at all. Swift was told that his father had died 7 months before his birth, just time enough to save his mother's reputation, as he often remarked. But there is no official record of his father's death either. We only know that his parents were married in 1664. It may even be that the baby's real father was someone else, a startling possibility that Swift himself may eventually have suspected. There is no solid evidence for that, but if those concerned wanted to keep it secret, they could have made sure that there would be no evidence. And in fact, many aspects of Swift's early life are puzzling, to say the least.
Thanks so much.
I think one thing I want to point out in the excerpt is that Damrosch is known for his almost like story-like, because his more like story-like kind of prose, and he does make a few assumptions about the people he's writing his life, and which I think is something different, and like in that some of his facts may not be true, but they are like as close to true as anyone could possibly get to, which I think is something that I think Damrosch does really well. If anyone else has anything else to add.
Yeah, it's interesting how he kind of involves the reader in the storytelling and the narration of these biographies. He acknowledges that the facts and the historical facts of Jonathan Swift's life are not actually established. And it's interesting how he makes clear right from the intro that a lot of the stuff he's writing is either he's deciding, he's kind of acknowledging that it's not necessarily true, but he's deciding, he's kind of explaining to the audience why he's deciding to choose one interpretation or not.
And you can clearly see from this excerpt that he has put a lot of research into his work to uncover all these little facts about Jonathan Swift's life. So he starts from Jonathan Swift's birth, and then the story sort of develops into including all these aspects of his life. And clearly, like, he has to go through an extensive research process and like a categorical process of organizing all of this information in order to write this sort of biography. And so later on during his Q&A, he's going to share more about his research process and more about how he approaches writing these extensive biographies on such interesting lives of different people.
He also, well, Ian typed in chat as well that it seems challenging to write a biography about someone who lived so long ago, and how little is known about parts of his life. That seems like a great question to maybe keep in mind for the Q&A. Yeah, so he's definitely gonna talk about that. It's gonna be really interesting.
And before he joins, in this like few minutes we have before he joins, try thinking of a few questions you might want to ask him, given his extensive writing career and all the advice that he might have to share. So if you have like a pencil somewhere in a notepad, or like if you're modern like me, you should use a computer. No, it might not be popular opinion, but draft some questions that you might want to ask him later, because there will be a chance for all of you to ask him questions.
Also, at the very end of this seminar, I guess, if you want to call it that, we're going to have a few writing workshops, or writing, more like writing prompts, kind of based off of off of this excerpt, as well as off of his actual interview.
So as we interview and you guys interview Leo Damrosch, you can take some notes on how he approaches that biography, so you can implement it in your own writing at the end of the session when we conduct our workshop. And speaking of Leo Damrosch, we see he has arrived, so I'll let Anaka introduce him for you guys. Anaka, I think you're muted.
Okay.
I guess it's time now. So let me introduce you to Professor Leo Damrosch, who we will interview about his biographies, his teaching, and the history of the novel. But before this, we asked the professor to give a brief comment about his own writing journey and the importance of writing reading, especially to him. So everyone, please give a round of applause for Professor Damrosch.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I was a child in the Philippines. My parents were missionaries. We lived in a very remote mountain village. We were the only foreigners there. All my friends were Filipino. And although they spoke English, reading was a real refuge for me. And perhaps if I'd grown up in this country, I wouldn't have been such a constant reader. And it just became an obvious life path to go on reading and talking about literature and then teaching it. So for me, it's a way of life and not just a job. And we're all fortunate if we can have that kind of a life. What more should I say, Anaka?
I think also that's perfect. I guess we can jump right into the actual interview. So I guess my first question is, you had written biographies on Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Jonathan Swift, among others. And what attracted you to these older and more traditional European intellectuals? And also, what is your approach to writing these biographies, and where do you begin?
Well, I might mention how I got started on biography. When I began teaching English literature, which is now half a century ago, it was dominated by what used to be called the New Criticism, which was already very old and tired by then. And that was an extremely systematic analysis of exactly how a poem works. They didn't even usually look at novels because they wanted small, manageable pieces of literature. And it just seemed boring and tiresome. And then it was overwhelmed in the 1970s, which is still very long ago, by what was called theory with a capital T, which came over from France, and it was all about psychology and sociology and economics and all the fields that people who taught literature were ignoring. And that was fine at first, but then it turned out to have its own kind of cult language and in-group way of talking about things. And increasingly, I thought those people aren't interested in literature. They're just using it as an object to do their operations upon. And biography was a way of talking about human lives. It's usually writers that I write about. And it's not so much because they're long ago European intellectuals as that was the field I'd spent my life in and was familiar with. And I actually think biographers get themselves in trouble when they just dive into something they knew nothing about until this week. And it's pretty hard to get up to speed on all the implications and resonances in somebody's life long ago. Of course, one remarkable difference from most biographers today is all I have is texts. It would be totally different to write a biography of somebody recently alive, with many people willing to talk to you afterwards, what they thought about that person. A hero of mine, Robert Caro, still hasn't finished. I think he's done 4 of the projected 5 volumes of a biography of Lyndon Johnson, probably just a name to young people today, but he was a very potent figure for good and bad when I was a young man. He was dragged into the Vietnam War by a bunch of advisors who thought they knew what they were doing, and then his pride was invested in it, and he caused no end of damage and ended up having to not run for re-election, became a kind of tragic figure. And Caro actually moved to Austin, Texas with his wife and lived there for 2 years because nobody would talk to some New York journalist. They just didn't trust him. And he had to gradually get to know people and get stories out of them that they were kind of reluctant to share. And I totally admire that. It's so different. All I have is documents in libraries. And of course, that's a challenge in itself to try to tease reality out of these things. But yeah, it's just, I've spent my life in libraries, and it was a way of telling human stories while still doing what I was familiar with. Sorry, that was a rambling answer.
You mentioned, I guess, if for biographies of authors or public figures who were more recent, biographers can interview people who knew him in life. The authors you write biographies on tend to be much older. What are your strategies you have on representing these authors' characters or understanding who they were without these kind of other interviews?
Well, there's no single way to do it, but of course, even Robert Caro has to evaluate how much to trust that he's hearing from somebody who may have an axe to grind. And in a way, that's what you're doing with Voices from the Past. Letters are invaluable. My biography of Rousseau relied on 50 volumes of correspondence that have been collected and published, not all by him, but letters to him, letters about him. And you get immersed in there, and in a way you do start living in his world. But you're still judging about Rousseau, I mentioned, because he was a very complicated character. Well, so was Jonathan Swift. So there were very different takes on what this guy really is like and whether you can believe him or not. And that's part of the interest, is figuring out who really was the guy who wrote Gulliver's Travels or The Social Contract, and why did they do it? And what was it expressing in themselves? Actually, there used to be an expression of definitive biography, and it might have been factually complete. If somebody lived long ago, there's probably no new evidence coming forward, but it can't be definitive because every biographer has their own angle and interest, and they notice things somebody else didn't. Right now, I have a contract still with Yale University Press, wonderful press, for a biography of Robert Louis Stevenson. And there's at least a dozen of them, and pretty much all of them are good. But none of them can be definitive because they're things I want to do that other people didn't do, but I've learned from every one of them. So in a way, you get into a kind of dialogue with other biographers too, because you're the ones who have spent the most time with this subject. And even if I don't meet them personally, I feel like we're sharing our thoughts.
And as you mentioned before, you need to conduct extensive research and catalog all of this information in order to formulate this biography. And you have these huge volumes of correspondence that you need to look over. So what is your approach, or how do you organize or categorize all of this information in order to formulate your biography?
Well, I do it in, I think, an unusual way. I think most biographers, and it's how I started, do the research for chapter 1 and then they write chapter 1. And there's an advantage in doing that because you have everything in your head at one time, and 2 years later, you'll be fuzzy about it. But it does mean it kind of ties your hand, and something goes into chapter 1 that maybe belonged to chapter 6, or maybe it shouldn't go in at all. And one of the great secrets of good writing, Stevenson actually used this expression himself. He said, "Oh my God, if I could just learn the art to omit, don't put everything in." And my wife is a playwright and who reads all my manuscripts with trenchant criticism, has a little acronym she puts in the margin sometimes, and sometimes they're ones we all know like TMI, but she has one that's RIS, and it means rock in stream. Your narrative was flowing along, and all of a sudden you put in this big hunk that stops us dead, and you may think it's interesting, but put it somewhere else or leave it out. But I can actually explain what I do now. I do all the reading for everything in the person's life. And if they're a writer, I have to read all of their works, of course, but I'd also like to read criticism, published criticism of their works, which biographers often don't bother with. But, you know, smart people have spent years and years trying to think why Treasure Island is a classic. And then I finally sort them all into piles, which are not necessarily chapters. And where I begin to see, I might use this here, I might use it there. And I asked Anaka if you could briefly make me co-host. I'm going to share my screen.
Yes, you are a co-host.
Okay. This is a pool table in my attic, and my study is next door to that room. And that is the book that became The Club, Johnson, Boswell, and the Friends Who Shaped an Age, which was my last biography but one. And you see those are all different categories with the yellow sheet on top. And I just kept piling them up there until I was ready to write. And a lot of it is kind of semi-written already, because you can see sometimes there's a whole paragraph there. There might be 2 pages stapled together. It might well go into the finished book more or less in that form, or it might go in the wastebasket. Most of those things probably did. So then I think it was 5 months later, I can't seem to advance it. There we are. 5 months later, there's the empty pool table, because now it's all in my computer. And this is the pool table last week. This is Robert Louis Stevenson. Here we go again. The piles aren't as big, but that's my process. And I showed it to a historian friend of mine. He said, table of contents. And that's exactly what it is. Okay, I'll unshare. Thanks, Anaka.
Sure, thank you. And this question's a bit kind of related to past answers, but do you feel emotionally bound to these subjects of your biographies? And even though I know that you know for many of them they're very old, and you don't actually, and you can't actually know them personally or know any of their friends personally, or know anyone who might have met them at some point personally. So how do you, or if you do at all, feel emotionally bound to who you decide to write about?
I think you have to feel at least some kind of sympathy and affinity, not necessarily someone you choose for a friend, let alone roommate. That is totally true of Rousseau. He was a difficult, almost sometimes clinically paranoid character, and you could not remain his friend for very long before something went wrong, and it was never his fault. But he was a genius. And trying to understand how this guy was basically self-educated and I think dyslexic, not a trivial point, because he read intensely but slowly. He didn't speed read. Came up with totally original ideas that had a greater effect in changing the world we still live in than any of his contemporaries. And in the end, I honor him, but that doesn't mean, you know, I'm exactly fond of him. But I have to have that sense of respect and interest in the character. The last biography I published was of Giacomo Casanova. And in the age of Me Too, if you know his name at all, that's a very tricky subject. And I certainly didn't try to whitewash him. I'm the first biographer that didn't. People basically just sort of snickered and got off on vicariously sharing his adventures. But he was a lot of things besides a seducer and a fascinating guy. There's enormous amounts of interesting material to fold into a biography. And I did live for a summer in Venice, which is when I got interested in him. That's where he's from. It's a fascinating city. You know, I certainly ended up fascinated by him, but I wouldn't say I would trust him an inch if I knew him as a person, so it's not exactly bonding with the character, but I think a truly debunking biography is kind of horrible, because then why are you even writing this if you despise the person so much?
How do you decide to, how do you choose who you're going to write your next biography on?
It's hard to say. I know how there's always a different reason. I mean, once you think what I'm doing now is writing biographies, you're always wondering who should I do next. The reason I did Rousseau was I used to teach a course on 18th century thought. I still do have a version of it. I've taught it in the Harvard Summer School before, though it's not the one Anaka took. I read a biography of Rousseau. It's in 3 volumes by a modern political scientist, and it's very, well researched. But it just made him sound boring and ordinary and uninteresting. And I thought that's probably the fault of the author, not Rousseau. If you ever read Rousseau's autobiography called Confessions, it's a world classic and very powerful insights into how you think about your own self. So I began thinking, what if I could write a biography of Rousseau? And I read French. I'm not totally fluent conversationally, but it was fun to do something that made me read a lot of French. I just found myself getting deeper and deeper into it. And that one took 10 years. I was teaching full time, and I sure had a lot to learn, even getting my French up to speed. The others have come more rapidly. And then after that, I thought, well, do you mind if I ramble on a little? Because like every book is different. So then I thought, well, okay, but Americans don't want to read about European people. They want to read about America. And I don't know if that's always true. And but what if I could use French somehow? And I got interested in Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to this country as a young lawyer and had just extraordinary travels through then a very young United States of America, even to what was then the edge of the wilderness in Ohio, and met all kinds of people, and wrote letters and diaries that didn't get into democracy in America, but that's certainly where the ideas came from. And I just got fascinated with that. So I wrote a little book called Tocqueville's Discovery of America. And then out of the blue, my editor at Yale, and I've now contracted to do my 5th book with her, her name is Jennifer Banks, just super editor, wrote to me, we'd never met, said she was casting around for suggestions, someone who could write a biography of Jonathan Swift. And the light bulb went off. And I thought, why shouldn't I do that? So I did it. And then after that, I've always taught 18th century English literature as my main theme. And I've written 2 books on Samuel Johnson. And I got interested in writing a book about the group, they called themselves the Club, of which he was the center. Quite amazing group of people. Edmund Burke was there. He joined it before he was even well known. Adam Smith was a member of it. Quite a lot of other remarkable people. So it became a kind of group biography. And then because of Venice, I'd always been interested in Casanova, and I didn't think much of the existing biographies. And I wanted to improve my Italian. And next thing I knew, I was writing that one. And then as for Stevenson, some years ago, my wife and I both happened to read Kidnapped, which is the sequel, not to Treasure Island, but it's his next novel set in his native Scotland, Catriona, which is the sequel to that one. They're both remarkably good books, and they're not just adventure stories. And she said, why aren't you writing a biography of Stevenson? And I thought, well, why not? So there we are. So that's how it happens. And if I live long enough, I'll probably write yet another one.
So I know you've had a very extensive writing career, and you've written a lot of varying forms of writing. So in general, what difficulties do you face as a writer, and how do you overcome them?
Well, it depends what you mean by difficulties. If it's difficulties in telling the story, that's, kind of conceptualizing each biography afresh. But it's totally different from the academic writing I used to do, which is how you get tenure and get a job at Harvard and so on. I don't, repent having done it, but then you're writing for a very small group of fellow specialists, not to say rivals. And there are certain moves you have to make to show them that you know something, or in particular, you read their article. I mean, I don't mean to be too cynical, but it's a very in-group kind of thing. And writing for a general audience is just totally different. What would be interesting? How shall I pace this story, and what shall I, as I was saying, leave out? Because even though it happened, it's not very interesting. I'll allude to it to show that I know it existed, but it's much more, I think, like writing a novel would be, though I've certainly never tried to do that, where, the proportion and the narrative energy are what you're focusing on. And that was, a craft I had to teach myself, because that was not how I was trained professionally.
Okay, thank you. And this is a question a bit more about your biographies. So you both teach about writing and about the people that you write about. And so how do those two processes like lean into each other? Like, both writing about people and also teaching about those same people.
Well, when I started out, again, to allude to the remote past, it was considered irrelevant to drag biography into teaching or writing about literature, because literature is self-contained and it tells its own story. And I just think that's wrong. But Northrop Frye, who was a very great critic, Canadian critic in the 50s, actually said, if we could discover a long-lost commentary on the Divine Comedy by Dante, it would be just one more Dante critic. He would have nothing to contribute that some guy teaching at Columbia University right now couldn't do instead. And I just think that's crazy. So I do think every kind of art, not just writing, comes out of a human consciousness and way of living life. And no art historian would write about Van Gogh's paintings without talking about Van Gogh's life, tragic and moving as it is. And so that's why I think they do belong together. And I always do try to teach works of literature or philosophy even as coming from somewhere in somebody's personal experience.
So I understand you taught a class on the rise of the novel. How do you understand the novel as a literary form? How has it changed, and how has it changed over time?
Well, it isn't a single thing at all. It originated out of medieval romances, the kind of thing that are, the Arthurian legends, and there were some ancient sort of novels that had to do with more ordinary life, but on the whole, novels were about people higher placed socially than ourselves, and with sort of epic lives. And the big breakthrough, which happened in the late 17th century, was to write stories about people with names like ourselves, with lives like ourselves. They might even have jobs like people have to support themselves. And then all the complexity of that much smaller scale existence. And growing up in a family and all of those things that became central to the novel. But once it got invented, everybody's always changing it, because the way it was done by the generation before always seems dated and formulaic. The way 1940s movies look like 1940s movies. They must have looked like realistic images of life in 1940. And so the novel does go on mutating constantly. And it reached a kind of classic summit in the 19th century novels of Tolstoy and Dickens and George Eliot. Large, comprehensive, coherent kind of worlds that you enter into. I think one reason the novel always satisfies me more than short stories, though there can be great short story writers, is you want to get deeply inside that world and live there for a while, rather than just suddenly find it's over. But those novels pretty soon looked dated, and the generation of Virginia Woolf and E.M. Forster certainly thought they didn't want to write the way those people did. And if anything, now I think the novel is struggling a bit because there are other media that are maybe more popular, and people don't necessarily grow up reading novels. And if they haven't always been part of your consciousness, then maybe movies were, and why not? So I'm not even sure the moment right now isn't not the death throes of the novel, but the time when it gets marginalized, the way poetry has. 100 years ago, everybody read the poems of Tennyson. Now, most people would say, I never read a poem. Why would I? And I'm not saying they have to.
Thank you. And this is a question almost exactly about that. So the novel is, at least to me, is like the most distinct about among other forms of literature because it has continued to have such a large, like a large following almost, which I think poetry and like short stories have declined drastically in the past 50 years. Why do you think the novel has continued to be popular even with the time of like social media? And you had said how it seems to be going down, but I think compared to other forms of reading, I think it's on the rise. Yeah.
It probably is, but you'd have to distinguish between the kind of novels that are bestsellers, which I don't at all look down upon, but which are pitched for a much bigger kind of audience, and the sort of, I don't want to call them highbrow, but the novels that are aimed at a more traditional audience that's grown up on literature. And I don't think their audience is as large. It may not have shrunk as much as other forms have. Certainly nobody's buying volumes of poetry anymore. But I think it's only because there's such a huge reading public that there can still be a substantial one for novelists. But I would think very few novelists today, and as indeed almost no playwrights, could support themselves with their writing. They mostly have adjunct teaching jobs or other ways of staying alive. Whereas the time was that a successful novelist could make a very substantial income just writing novels.
Okay, and then for our next question, we were wondering, what did it take to be a writer in the 16th, 17th century compared to today's writers?
Well, there was no reading public as we understand it. If a work of fiction got published, it might sell 500 copies. And there were no royalties. So even if it sold a lot more than that, the initial payment from the publisher was all that the writer would get. So in fact, almost nobody was a professional writer. And that's true of the 18th century Rise of the Novel course that Anaka took. Every single person that we read was a businessman or a noblewoman who had her own income, or a lawyer who became a judge, or an army officer, and they all wrote fiction as a sort of hobby on the side. So if you were going to be a writer in the 16th century, you probably were writing for a wealthy patron, probably noble. And if you were, for example, a poet like John Donne or George Herbert, very great poets, you might not even think of publishing your work in print. It got handed around in manuscript in the tiny coterie world that you were writing it for. And so the big breakthrough that happened toward the end of the 18th century was a large enough reading public that, for example, Jane Austen, who was a single woman living with her family in a remote town, could think, I could actually help support my family by writing novels. And that's how she got herself started. By the middle of the 19th century, somebody like Dickens could actually make a lot of money, but he also wrote an incredible number of novels. He was a workaholic, and most of them are great. But I think now it's, again, a marginal profession, and a writer has to have other forms of support. I'm not talking about the bestsellers that get on Oprah's list, but I'm talking about the kind of novelists who aspire to carry on that tradition.
So in parallel with literary forms and differing roles of writers, how has the publishing process and the publishing industry changed over time?
Well, I don't know that I understand the industry, as a business as well as I might, but the number of publishing houses has shrunk just the way so many other things have merged, the way hospitals merge. And they have much more monopoly power than they used to. It was the case just as when I was young, there must have been 30 makes of automobiles that we knew how to recognize, and then they all got swallowed up by General Motors or whatever. And it became impossible for some small marginal publisher to actually make a mark. So it's become, I think, a kind of closed industry now. And that's been a major change. Well, another thing that's happened is when I was young, every household had the Saturday Evening Post, and every Saturday Evening Post issue had short stories in it. And that was a way a writer could expect to reach a very large popular audience if the Post would buy their story. And nowadays, I suppose, even the New Yorker is a kind of specialized publication, and increasingly print publications are giving up and quitting anyway and existing only online. So I think the economics have changed drastically, just in certainly my lifetime.
Thank you. And as kind of a follow-up to that, and about the publishing world, what do you think that the publishing world shifted from like publishing in parts, like in like series, and to kind of now publishing in complete forms of the book?
Well, it's partly the books are shorter now. For example, George Eliot's Middlemarch, which many people, and I am one of them, think is the greatest English novel. And if you guys haven't read it, that's a treat that I envy you doing for the first time. It's an almost tragic novel about two parallel stories, a young professional man, a doctor, and a young woman, but in early 19th century England, there's no profession open to her, both with very high ideals and aspirations. They each make a dreadfully wrong marriage. They don't know it's wrong. They're young and hopeful. And once they've done it, they're stuck with the consequences of it. And it interweaves not just their stories, but a whole world of people in the most powerful way. And it brings tears to your eyes to read Middlemarch. But it's very long. And nobody would have just sat down as we do today with a huge fat paperback. They waited for the next installment. And those writers were so confident in their powers that Dickens certainly would publish the first installment of a novel he hadn't finished writing yet, knowing that he could perfectly well pull it off. So it was more like, following a mini-series on TV. And you had the leisure to read it and look forward to the next episode. And if people want to have a self-contained novel, it's not going to be 800 pages long anymore. And so that's been a major change. And I don't think who would now read 3 or 4 chapters of a novel and wait a month to see the next one.
I think also that kind of ties into the impatient minds of today, like with social media, how people don't want to wait at all for any kind of entertainment.
Yeah, and also people, which I don't reproach them for, are mostly not readers. And by the time you get to college, it's a bit late to start being taught how to read and write, in the sense of, read critically and write expressively. And whenever I get at Harvard a student who's just an extraordinarily good writer, when I will start chatting with them, it will turn out they were reading books as soon as they, could stand up on their hind legs. And they've just internalized so much writing that it has become part of them. And somebody who didn't have that experience can be at least as intelligent as the first person, but it's too late to really know how to express yourself in language, I think.
So you mentioned Middlemarch. Are there any other books you think every young writer or reader should read?
Well, we all have our personal favorites. I mean, the other novel I think is just unbelievably great is Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, but it's not like there's nothing you should reproach yourself for not having read. And, we all have our own particular things that we enjoy. Like when I was young, The Lord of the Rings was very new and was held in contempt by the, not just academic world, but by, people who thought of themselves as literary, experts, but it's a work of genius. And Tolkien managed at once to bring a completely imaginative world alive, which is filled with, magic and rings and enchanters and everything, but to tell it like a modern novel with realistic detail, and to put the hobbits at the middle, who are certainly not heroic except when they find they have to be. And we've learned to see that it is a true masterpiece. But I was reading it back then, and before anybody else was, in a way, and I'm glad they caught up with it. But right now, I'm reading for the second time a sequence of novels, it might be 13 or 15, I forget, by Patrick O'Brian, which are a series of Royal Navy novels set in the early 18th century. And I won't bore you with why I think they're great, but they are just totally compelling. And they used to be thought of as marginal, historical fiction. In fact, he's a great novelist, but I wouldn't object if somebody else, my wife has never wanted to read them. I haven't urged her to. They're a kind of pleasure that I share with quite a few readers who do like Patrick O'Brian. So I wouldn't, I would never say, here's the list you got to check off.
Thank you. I think now we'll probably turn to the audience if they have any questions for you. Yeah, just shout them out if you have any.
Most people are mute, both in video and audio at this moment. I'm looking at my own image. Is a weird flickering happening above my head? Or
Yeah, it's a bit strange.
it certainly is strange. I'm not aware of causing. I think it's you, in fact, Annika, that are there. They went away. Did you make that happen?
No.
Okay. All right.
So now we would just like to invite all the participants to ask your questions. Feel free to put it in the chat. Like here we have one new question in the chat, and it reads, do you have a favorite subject among your biographies and why?
You're asking me that. Well, it's like saying, who's your favorite child? I mean, each of them was so enjoyable to do. I think I may have done some more effectively than others, but I wouldn't rank them that way.
And I have a question, and it's, do you have any thoughts or opinions on the current education system in, like, for example, the United States, and like how well it cultivates like grasp or understanding in the English language, and what opinion you have on it based on your own teaching experience?
Well, I think it's well known that the humanities are in trouble. Increasingly, people think that education is supposed to get them a job. And Lord knows it ought to help them do that. But I think there was a time when it was not understood to be quite such a matter of cause and effect, so that a law firm would look for a history or a language or English major as somebody who had worked with language and was intelligent and could analyze problems. Except for med school, where obviously there are things you must have in order to be pre-med, I think there wasn't that sense of choosing a lucrative career at the moment you start college. And that's a problem. So humanities majors are shrinking everywhere. They certainly have at Harvard. And people will take a humanities course on the side. They may enjoy it, but but we're losing our place in the culture. And I'm not saying the culture doesn't have a right to go a different way, but that's an issue. And also there's the problem, as I was already suggesting, if you haven't grown up using language, you're probably going to use it generically and crudely. And I remember talking to my great colleague, now retired, Helen Vendler, who's a critic of poetry, and she was at Harvard longer than me. And she said when she started teaching Harvard students, she realized, brilliant though these people may be, most of them have never written anything longer than a book report about a work of literature. So showing them how to write a long, thoughtful essay about a poem is something you have to start from scratch, which she loved to do. She's a very great teacher. But the time was that, well, I went to a boarding school and we were given that stuff all the time from the start. So that was what you learned how to do before you even went to college. we have a great education system, but I do think it's gotten a little too much pragmatically oriented and less interested in values and meaning.
Thank you. I think I see a question in the chat from somebody who says that you have been teaching and writing for a long while. What keeps you teaching?
What keeps me teaching? I took a year off from it. I thought maybe I'm done now, and I really missed it because when you're writing for publication maybe 2 or 3 years from now for people you will never see, that's a completely different kind of way of understanding how you communicate. And I particularly love teaching in the summer school because a regular Harvard course is people from a very specific age group who are all very smart, but in a way it's more interesting, as Anaka remembers, that you'll have people in their 50s or even 60s. You have brilliant high school kids like herself. You have everybody in between. Some are in college, some dropped out, some may never even gone to college. All the different life experiences. Plus, instead of everybody being in a single room in Cambridge, Massachusetts, you know, we had people in Ankara and Beijing and all over the place and all meeting in real time as if we were in the same room together. And I find that extremely enjoyable, and I would hate to have to give it up.
Another question asks, can you say what specific event in your life inspired you to tell the stories of others, biographies? What certain life events made you the writer you are today?
I don't know that there was a specific event. I mean, I kind of blundered into my career because when I was in college, I had some thoughts of being a journalist, but I knew I didn't have the kind of drive and probably people skills to have done it well. I can't resist asking, Max, are you in fact related to David Halberstam?
Maybe distantly. There's a lot of Halberstams.
Are there? But that was the kind of, you know, extraordinary figure that I knew I couldn't possibly aspire to be. But I was a good student and I was used to taking courses, and why not try graduate school? So that's what I did. And I wouldn't even call it, you know, a choice so much as I just kept on doing it. And I liked it and got some rewards for it. So it was kind of least resistance. I'm not necessarily offering myself as a role model. That I might well have spent more time trying to understand. Well, of course, when I was in college, this was way back in the early 60s, people just followed kind of prescribed routes. Most of my classmates went to law school or med school or Wall Street. And I didn't want to do those three things, but not that I don't respect people who do, but I just went on doing the kind of thing they did. I went on with something, you know, that I was already trained to do.
Thank you. I think someone else in the chat asked, she says that writing a book, especially a first book, is of course a very intimidating task. And I know they talked a bit about the process involved, but how did you go about writing your first biography, and what advice would you give to someone who is just starting that long process?
Well, I can only speak for biography. I mentioned in passing my wife as a playwright. I couldn't possibly write plays to invent, you know, language that's believable, that's dialogue between people who are going to be embodied by real life actors and make the whole thing cohere and keep moving and hold an audience. I can imagine doing that. So what I'm doing really is something much simpler, which is, okay, what is interesting about this person I want to write about? What should I read before I'll be ready to write it? And then it kind of begins like that pool table falling into place as I get to know it better. So it's each project is its own fresh start. I don't know that there is a template I could suggest. We're flickering again. That's kind of creepy.
Yeah. Thank you. I guess I have a question actually. So you mentioned that you've never written any novels before, but in the way they write biographies, they're very novelistic in a way. And why did you never actually approach writing a novel?
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I do try to give them some narrative energy. and get the rocks out of the stream. But again, a novel is inventing characters, out of thin air and making them interact. And it's a great gift. And I think it's not something easily acquired. I think a good novelist has put in a lot of apprenticeship, whether in workshops and that kind of thing nowadays, or just on their own, before they could get there. And I never felt I would be particularly good at it. So I don't think it was cowardice. I think it was self-knowledge that I didn't try it.
Also, I have a question that is kind of an assumption. I was reading a review of one of your books a few weeks ago, and it said that your writing was different because you made assumptions about the people you were writing about because they lived such a long time ago. Can you expand on that?
I'm sorry, to reformulate that. I didn't quite.
Yeah. So you would make a small assumptions about the characters' lives, according to this review. I just wanted to either both fact check that and ask you to expand on that.
Well, you always have to make assumptions, but I think as long as you are honest about them and share with the reader where you're guessing and where you're not, we make assumptions about people we know. In fact, E.M. Forster said a long time ago, he was a great novelist, that you know people in a novel better than you know most people in your own life, because the novelist makes them three-dimensionally understandable, and human beings often are not that way. And they can have big surprises. And I think what I have to do, for example, with Jonathan Swift, who was a very secretive character, and I felt like the then standard biography of Swift tried to sanitize all of his mysteries and relations with women and other things and try to make him into a very ordinary guy. And I felt like there's got to be more to it than this. And I dug around and found quotations from people who knew him and, gaps that aren't very well explained unless you start guessing what's being hidden here. But I tried to make that explicit in the biography. We're trying to figure out why there are those gaps, and I'll tell you when we're just guessing about how to fill them. And I don't think that's illicit at all. The idea you can only tell what you can prove would be hard to do even for a living person, and you cannot do it for someone 200 years ago.
Another question is, you mentioned, I guess, more the focus kind of on education as a means to kind of choosing your profession with med school or law school. Do you see interest in the humanities, in English, history declining?
Yeah, oh, it definitely is. I was just reading an op-ed piece, I forget in which publication, by a historian saying, I think nationwide this is true, 70% of classes in probably all humanities subjects are taught by, do you know what adjuncts are? Somebody who has a very temporary job, year to year, could be fired at any time, no benefits. They probably have to have a whole bunch of similar jobs, probably at several institutions to make ends meet. And they can be very dedicated teachers, but the institution is not really, it has no stake in them anymore. And so it has a very small number of tenured people who are pretty comfortable, but who have fewer and fewer students. And that's just nationwide. That's not something any individual institution could change unilaterally. But another thing that's happened is the teaching faculty, even at the wealthiest universities, has tended to shrink a little bit over the years. And the number of administrators has gone up by about 300%. Deans, sub-deans, people with all kinds of specialties, they have no trouble hiring those. And it is a very great change in the nature of an institution when the people who actually do the teaching are the marginal employees. Yes.
What can we do maybe to increase interest in the humanities, or what can we do to improve the downward trend?
I honestly don't know, because as my colleague Helen was saying, if the high schools aren't really teaching it anymore, then it's kind of late for the colleges to start doing it. And I mean, I don't know, when you say, what can we do? I mean, we can vote, I guess, but I mean, these are colossal cultural issues, not matters easily fixed. Ian, your
I see
hand up?
Ian with his hand up.
I've actually got a question, which is what's the furthest you've ever gotten along into a biography before you decided like you either like didn't want to finish it or like you couldn't find yourself able to finish it?
I don't think that's happened. I've been lucky, I guess. I don't say it couldn't happen, but you know, usually I don't even begin. I see a creature. Usually I don't even begin until I've already done enough reading and thinking about it that I think, yeah, this is going to work. I've certainly had projects, but they're more like academic ones where I decided it's not going to work. But I don't think you get very far into the actual writing unless you're pretty confident that this is what you want to do.
If I may ask, because most novels now, most biographies, even more, they usually tell stories of one character or, well, one person. I feel like that kind of reflects that we live in a very like sorry, I'm Polish, individualistic times, very weirdly romantic in that way. So how what was the difference, or I don't know, maybe a struggle when writing The Club, where the focus in us is not only on a group of persons, a group of people, but the camaraderie between them?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was a challenge, and I'm not sure, having done it, that it could be really, really properly done, because even though they called themselves a club, it met once a week in a tavern. It didn't have a formal premises, but anyone who wanted to show up did from this group. They were very careful how they chose people. It had to be somebody interesting. They had to be doing something probably different from what other people do. So we've got all different angles. A single black ball would keep a candidate out. So you couldn't just have everybody's best friend. Even so, they didn't always show up. It was kind of random. If James Boswell, who was a brilliant writer, hadn't actually recorded a lot of their conversations, we wouldn't even know how they talked to each other. And even so, and some reviewers in my book pointed it out, I haven't really shown that they cooperated in some systematic way. They were just people who hung out together, and I can't deny that. So in the end, I wrote individual biographies, which is, you know, as you're saying, is what biographies tend to be. They're all folded together, but this, you know, what Johnson's life was like, what Boswell's, Gibbon, the great historian, Edmund Burke, Adam Smith, those are little biographies with a lot of overlap. Because I think finally human lives are individual. You could write the story of a marriage or of a very close collaboration between several scientists or something like that. Of course you could, but I think biography is about individual humans.
I had a question. I'm in 9th grade right now. Would you have any advice for someone like me?
I'm sorry, I didn't miss the first part of what you said.
I'm in 9th grade right now. Would you have any advice for someone who's like in the beginning of high school?
Advice of what kind? My goodness. Spiritual advice? I don't know what to tell you. Yeah.
Like writing advice or like anything like that.
If you want to write, if you're interested in writing, then I would say this. I think a good writer probably always ought to do what Robert Louis Stevenson did. He was, by the way, a very casual student. He went to the University of Edinburgh, but he cut class most of the time and wasn't very interested in his courses. But he taught himself to write by systematically working at it. He was always working at it, trying to express things clearly, even if it was just a description of something he was looking at. And he did something that's kind of out of fashion now, but great writers have often done it. He would imitate the style and manner of a writer he admired. And it's not like he wanted to be their clone, but how did they do it? You know, what is the skill here? It'd be like imitating a great athlete. You know, what are those moves? Could I learn to do that? And it was instead of thinking I have to express my own inner vision right from day one, I'll figure out what my vision is, but first I need the craft. So the one advice I would give for someone who wants to be a writer is just do a lot of writing, not to immediately show it to people, but just to work on whether you're finding ways of saying something well.
I think George Saunders also said, and many other authors also describe this period of time as a writer where you're when you try to imitate authors you admire, which kind of allows you to understand going into other people's writing voices before you can kind of start discovering your own. What were your influences, I guess, as a writer, and how did you discover your voice?
I don't know if I even have a voice so much. Maybe I'm more impersonal than I should be. I admire the writers. A historian, a biographer I greatly admire. It's a guy named Richard Holmes, writes about romantic poets mostly. And Holmes is much more there as a personal presence in his writing than I am. I'm sort of inhibited that way. So I don't know if I got a voice so much as just a narrative style. And that was just by dint of working on it. I think my writing when I was in college was more kind of mannered and artificial, and I wouldn't be able to stand it if I had to reread it today. But I guess I was groping toward how to be clear and expressive without showing off too much. But if I knew how to show off more, I would.
Thank you. And I guess this question is a bit connected to one that you answered in the past about how the novels that come out today are a little more, they're not as perhaps fully fledged, but I think that's kind of not quite nice. But like, would you compare the novels, like the picaresque novels of the past, like Tom Jones or Robinson Crusoe, to those same kind of novels now made for the masses?
I'm not a voracious enough reader of contemporary fiction. I will say my wife is very literary. She increasingly starts a novel that's been enthusiastically reviewed and just gets fed up with it. She just says it's not interesting enough, or I'm more willing than she is to go back to old novels, and she keeps hoping to find something fresh. And I don't know what that means, but it probably does mean it's not so clear. Somebody like John Updike or Nabokov were writing for a particular kind of literate audience that they could be confident they could connect with. And they both wrote lots of novels, and very good ones. And I don't know how many novelists anymore have that kind of career. Maybe Joyce Carol Oates, who's still alive, has had that kind of career, that is a long sequence of novels that build up to a sense of a life work. Instead, you get a lot of first novels. People are trying it out, and then it doesn't grow from there.
I think also with Nabokov, sorry, Max, he's someone who you really need to trust before you go into his work. Because I feel like for many modern novels, you have to really, like, they have to kind of just jump right in and make it entertaining as soon as they possibly can. But with like novels in the past, like there's almost like they almost have like a history with their audience, whereas many of the modern writers don't have that same kind of history and trust in their following.
Yeah, that's right. And also, I think a lot of them have come out of creative writing programs, and they've been doing workshops all the time, and there's a kind of in-group way of being a novelist, just as playwrights now all have come out of writing programs. And Tennessee Williams didn't go to a writing program. Arthur Miller didn't. Certainly Samuel Beckett didn't. Those plays came out of different places in their own experience.
Someone in the chat, Delaney Santarelli asked, I don't think we answered this question yet, but as an author who writes biographies, what would you consider to be elements of a reputable source? And also, you mentioned all these correspondences and other sources you used for your biographies. How do you get these sources? Do you have to do digging? Where do you find them?
Well, I've always myself worked with things that are in print. There are people who write biographies based on unpublished letters and manuscripts, and that's a commitment to spend hours and days and weeks in archives that I've just never made. That could be very exciting if you find things that have never been seen before. But what I've always been working with is things that have not only been seen, but they've been published. And the question is then just putting them in dialogue with each other and trying to hear where they're coming from. And often somebody else will have published an explanation of something. I'll give you one example. I'll try to do it briefly. When Jonathan Swift was a young man, he had a job as a kind of private secretary to a retired diplomat in England. Swift was an Irishman. He thought the diplomat was going to give him a political career. The diplomat was completely disaffected with politics and didn't do a damn thing for him and died without, he'd wasted 10 years working for this guy. But at the same time, he got involved with the guy's young daughter, first as her tutor, because she was just a kid, and then eventually they probably were lovers, though it's not clear and the whole thing is vague. And the reason I'm telling you this is somebody in a magazine in the 18th century said that he knew all these people and he could tell some stories about them, which he did. And it's always been regarded as anonymous. It's in a magazine. It was, 40 years later. Why would you believe any of that? And some guy at the University of Tulsa, and he published it in a Tulsa publication, so hardly anybody ever saw it, figured out who that guy was. And he was the chaplain in that very household of that nobleman, and he knew everybody, and the stories he told must be true. And so that's the kind of thing that's very exciting. I've never done it myself, but then I can put it in my book and say, I think now we've got the key that opens this door. So even if it's a long ago printed source, if you ask the right questions, you might get it to speak.
Thank you. I think if no one else has any questions, I'd like to, on behalf of everyone here, I'd like to thank Professor Damrosch for making the time and effort to come out on a Sunday morning to talk.
Well, I'm just sitting at home, so thank you very much, Anaka. It's a pleasure.
And I really loved our discussion about the impact of technology, the rise of the novel, and also the history of the novel and of publications. I think we're going to end with a writing prompt based on some of your work. Sarah, if you want to put that in the chat.
Yeah, we want to, just, I guess everyone, as this concludes our session with Leo Damrosch, Professor Damrosch, everyone, I guess, give him a round of applause. Reactions in the Zoom chat. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed talking to you guys.
Thank you so much. We loved your insights. It was very enlightening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. All right. So I am going to lead a brief workshop before we all leave. So I first have a character planning sheet I'm just going to put in the chat quickly. And we're just going to use this as a sort of reference to just talk about what Leo Damrosch has told us about writing biographies. So the general prompt we have is to create a character based on a real life figure, for example, like your favorite author, a favorite family member, etc. And then following Leo Damrosch's approach, write an introduction to a biography that introduces this character and their backstory. And because most of this workshop was sort of like a lecture style, we have like a panel and we're just questioning Leo Damrosch. We want to create this character together just to make this meeting more interactive and more engaging. So if you guys want to open the example character chart, as you can see on this chart, we have like a lot of different aspects of a character that you might want to consider. Clearly, this is just a reference. It's just a guide. It's not something you necessarily need to make about the character before you start writing like all of this, because that would be very tedious. And as you write more about the character, you start, and thank you, Max, for the screen share. And after you write more about a character, you start to get to know them more, and you start to develop more throughout your writing. That's why you have like first drafts and second drafts and all of that. Your first draft is never going to be perfect because you realize things as you write that you might want to edit earlier on in your book or in your piece. So
I think she's frozen, but I think no one's
the generic parts like their name and all this, and we have aspects of the character that you would find in like regular people. So I'm going to pass it on to any of you guys in the audience. What are some ideas you have for this character, just to lay a foundation of what we can build off of, because we want to create a character together?
Yeah, and you guys can I guess shout out in unmute yourselves, shout out any ideas, and or type it in chat as well. This is yeah. So I'm gonna screen share here. I don't think I can actually type in this, but let's see if I can annotate here.
And feel free to be as wacky as possible. We're not looking for a perfect character here. We're looking for someone interesting. So
Yeah, let's start with the name. Any ideas, anyone?
I think instead of starting with a name, because the name sort of, a lot of authors base the name of a character off of their the aspects of the character. Like you would go on like name reference and you would just like search out like this word in Latin